Right now, somewhere in Australia, people are paying less for a house than you'd spend on a decent second-hand car. Not in some theoretical future, not as a bidding strategy. It's already documented, already listed, already sold. Properties changing hands for 25,000 Australian dollars, 20,000 Australian, even less. I know that sounds like a misprint. It's not. And the system that sets prices in Sydney and Melbourne has absolutely no interest in making sure you ever hear about these places. These aren't rumour prices pulled from a local Facebook group. They're pulled from realestate.com.au editorial features and homely.com.au active listings, the same portals Australians use every single day to hunt for property. What those portals don't do is put these towns on the front page. You have to know where to look. And what you find, when you do look, is that this isn't one isolated anomaly. It's a pattern. 5 towns, 5 documented prices, 5 completely different reasons why the market just stopped caring and left land sitting there for anyone who shows up. There are 51 cast-iron human figures standing on a salt pan plain outside of Menzies, Western Australia. Sculptor Anthony Gormley installed them in 2003 on Lake Ballard. Life-sized forms spread across one of the flattest, most desolate stretches of land on the continent. They're there because the landscape is so empty, so stripped of human noise, that they almost make sense. They feel like the right monument for a place that once held 10,000 people and now holds 524. Menzies was born in 1894, when gold was pulled out of the Western Australian goldfields and the population exploded almost overnight. By the early 1900s, the town was real. Hotels, banks, civic buildings, the infrastructure of a city in miniature. Then the gold thinned, the economy contracted, and the people left. They didn't all leave at once. The decline was slow enough to be cruel. Decades of attrition, building by building, family by family, until the 2021 ABS census recorded just 524 residents where 10,000 once lived. What's left behind isn't just emptiness, it's dwellings. Structures that nobody sells because there's no market, and nobody demolishes because it costs money to do that too. The ABS census recorded 42.7% of dwellings in Menzies as vacant in 2011. Nearly half the buildings in town had no one in them. That number is not a historical curiosity. It is the structural condition that sets the price. When nearly half of a town's housing stock sits empty, the handful of properties that do move have no floor. A house in Menzies surfaced in a realestate.com.au editorial article, aggregating sub-$35,000 properties nationally at $25,000. That's the ask. $25,000 for a freestanding dwelling in a town with heritage architecture, functioning road access on Highway 1, and a community that, against all demographic logic, has refused to fully disappear. The Shire of Menzies still operates. There's still a pub. The Gold Rush era streetscape still stands. But you need to understand what you're actually buying into, because there's no version of this story that doesn't include the hard part. The nearest hospital is 132 kilometres south in Kalgoorlie. If something goes wrong at 2 in the morning, that's the number you're calculating against. Perth, the nearest major city, sits 729 kilometres to the southwest, a drive that crosses some of the most arid terrain in Australia. The median weekly household income in Menzies, as recorded by the ABS in 2021, was $1,260, well below the WA state median. The local economy runs on heritage tourism and a thin residual connection to the broader goldfields industry, and yet people still live there. Not because they had no choice, but because the calculus eventually tips. At $25,000 for a house, the mortgage, if you even need one, becomes almost abstract. The Gormley sculptures draw visitors from across the world. The salt pan light has no parallel on the continent, and the isolation, which is the primary reason prices stay this low, is also the primary reason certain people actively choose it. The town is not for everyone. It never was. But it's real. It's documented. And the price hasn't moved because the population hasn't either. The first thing you should know about Andermuka is that some of the houses there are underground. Not metaphorically, literally carved into the bedrock, dugouts hollowed from the rock as a direct response to a summer that regularly pushes past 40 degrees Celsius. When the temperature outside is lethal, you go below the surface. The earth itself becomes your insulation. It is one of the most practical architectural responses to climate on the continent, and it is also the reason you can still buy one of those dugouts for around 20,000 Australian dollars. Andamuka's existence traces back to the 1940s, when opal fields were discovered in this part of South Australia. A miners set up camp with the intention of extracting and moving on. Some of them stayed. A settlement grew around the claims, not a planned town, not a council-serviced suburb, but a working miners' community that built what it needed and nothing more. The fibro shack, the dugout, the corrugated iron structure, these are not failures of architecture. They are honest responses to a place that was never designed for comfortable permanence. The ABS census in 2021 recorded 74.9% of Andamuka's dwellings as vacant. Let that sit for a moment. 3 out of every 4 structures in town had no one living in them. That is the highest vacancy rate of any settlement in this video. It is not a sign of collapse. The town still functions, opal claims still operate, tourism still brings visitors out to see the stones and the dugouts. But it does explain, with complete clarity, why a 2-room fibro shack and a carved stone dugout both appear in the same realestate.com.au editorial feature at 20,000 Australian dollars to $22,000 Stalers. The current population sits at 262 people. The median weekly household income, per ABS 2021 data, was $1,374. Roxby Downs, which has functioning services including a hospital, sits 29 kilometres away according to Health Direct, close enough to be the reference point for medical emergencies, but not close enough to make Andamuka feel suburban. There is no formal local council here. The Outback Communities Authority administers the area, which is a bureaucratic way of saying that the usual infrastructure, guarantees most Australians take for granted, do not fully apply. What Andamuka does have, and this matters because this is what the price doesn't reflect, is one of the most distinctive built environments in the Southern Hemisphere. The dugout houses maintain a relatively stable interior temperature through summer without mechanical cooling. The opal fields around the town produce stones that end up in jewellery stores in Sydney, Tokyo and London. The landscape is brutal and flat and ochre-coloured, and in the right light it stops looking like Earth. The people who live there permanently have made a decision that most Australians never seriously consider, that comfort, as conventionally defined, is negotiable. At $20,000 Australians for an underground house in the South Australian desert, it turns out you can negotiate quite a lot. Checkpoint A. You've just seen 2 towns where a house costs less than most people spend on a gap year. But the next place on this list isn't just about price. It's about what happens when an entire regional economy vanishes not once, but twice. And the weekly personal income recorded there is 524 Australians. Not household income, personal income. That number has consequences that go well beyond the property market. In the 1890s, Wilcannia was the 3rd busiest inland port in Australia. Wool bales moved down the Darling River by paddle steamer toward the coast, and a town that organised that trade had roughly 3,000 residents, a courthouse built from local sandstone, a post office built to last, and the reasonable expectation that it would keep growing. That courthouse still stands. The post office still stands. The population is now 735. The collapse came in stages. Railways replaced river transport, not overnight but decisively, and the paddle steamer economy that had built Wilcannia simply had no successor. The town receded. Then drought came, intermittently and brutally, across the decades that followed. Each dry period pushed more families out. The Darling River, which had been the town's entire reason for existing as a commercial centre, periodically reduced to a trickle. The population that once organised itself around the river's productivity found less and less reason to stay. By the 2021 ABS census, Wilcannia held just 735 people, down from roughly 3,000 at its 1890s peak. A house sold there in 2025, documented in the realestate.com.au sold property database, under listing ID $1,498,35408 at 31,000 Australian dollars. That sale is not a data quirk. It reflects a market where demand is structurally low because the economic base that would generate demand collapsed over a century ago and has not been replaced.
The hardest number in Wilcanya's profile is not the house price. The ABS recorded the median weekly personal income there in 2021 at $524. Not household income, personal income. Roughly a third of the New South Wales state average. The nearest hospital is in Broken Hill, over 200 kilometres to the southwest. This is far west New South Wales, the phrase on the map that means exactly what it says. Services that other Australians treat as ambient background features of modern life require, out here, genuine planning and genuine travel. And yet, the sandstone buildings from the 1890s are heritage listed. They are not crumbling. They are standing in a settlement where the infrastructure around them has contracted, but the physical evidence of what this place once was remains visible on every major street. The courthouse, the post office, the old commercial buildings, they are the bones of a riverport economy that the railway killed, preserved by the dry western air that keeps everything longer than it should. For a buyer willing to engage seriously with remoteness, 31,000 Australian dollars still gets you a house within walking distance of some of the most historically significant vernacular architecture in New South Wales. Wilcanya is not an easy sell. The isolation is real, the income data is stark, and the distance to hospital is not something to minimise. But it is a real town, with a real community, with a real sold property record on realestate.com.au to anchor the price. The river that built it is still there, still flowing in wet years, still the defining feature of the landscape. Some things survive the economies that created them. Wilcanya is proof of that. Still here, still listed, still priced in a way that makes every eastern seaboard property market look like a different planet. Checkpoint B. 3 towns so far, all on the mainland, all with vacancy rates that would be headline news anywhere else. But the next 2 are in Tasmania, and they share something none of the mainland towns do. Both sit within 170 kilometres of the same hospital, both have populations well below 1,000, and both were built by extraction industries that left visible marks on the land itself. One of them has a landscape that looks unlike anything else in Australia. You'll know it when you see it. Silver, found in the Tasmanian wilderness in 1882, did what silver has always done. It pulled people in from everywhere, fast. By 1903, Zeehan had a population of around 10,000. There were hotels. There was a school of mines, opened in 1894, designed with the permanence of a building meant to educate generations. There were smelters, processing the ore coming out of the West Coast mountains. Zeehan was not a temporary camp. It was a city in miniature on Tasmania's remote west coast, built around the assumption that the silver would last. The smelters closed in 1913. The assumption was wrong. The departure of the industry that had built the town triggered a demographic contraction that has never fully reversed. The University of Tasmania's Companion to Tasmanian History documents this decline, tracing the arc from boom-era city to the 702 residents recorded by the 2021 ABS census. The West Coast Heritage Centre, housed inside the original 1894 School of Mines building, now functions as the regional archive for that period, a museum inside a building that was built for the future and ended up cataloguing the past. The ABS recorded 29.3% of Zeehan's dwellings as vacant in 2016. The employment base that might fill those dwellings, the one that was supposed to replace the smelters, never fully materialised. Tourism helps. The west coast of Tasmania draws visitors for wilderness access and landscape, but tourism employment is seasonal and thin, and it does not generate the kind of residential demand that fills vacant housing at scale. The result is a listing environment where land blocks appear on homely.com.au at 30,000 Australian dollars, with a second block in the same active listing feed at 39,000 Australian dollars. Those prices reflect something real about Zeehan's position. It is a town with genuine historical texture, functioning community infrastructure, including the museum and a working pub, and a surrounding landscape, the Tasmanian West Coast wilderness, that is World Heritage protected and structurally remote. The West Coast Wilderness Railway runs nearby. The mountain terrain to the east is part of a World Heritage Area. For land priced at $30,000 Australian, the physical context is extraordinary by any reasonable measure. The drawback is equally unambiguous. The Northwest Regional Hospital sits 130 kilometres from Zeehan, a single-road drive through mountain terrain on Tasmania's west coast. That road is not always straightforward in poor weather, and the west coast gets substantial rainfall. Medical self-sufficiency is not optional here. It is the baseline assumption of living this far from services. The regional economy has not found a replacement for the silver-lead industry that closed its smelters more than a century ago. Weekly incomes reflect that gap, and the population at 702 is small enough that community services scale accordingly. But Zeehan has something that the mainland entries in this list don't. It has survived long enough and retained enough of its original built fabric that the heritage argument carries weight on its own. The 1894 School of Mines building alone is an architectural document of what the silver boom expected of itself. You can buy a land block next to that history for $30,000 Australian. The silver is gone. The building is still there. And the price hasn't moved in a direction that suggests anyone on the mainland has figured that out yet. There is no way to describe the hills around Queenstown without sounding like you're exaggerating. So let's just start with the fact. A century of copper smelting, combined with the wholesale clearing of surrounding timber to fuel the smelters, stripped the hills of every living thing. The sulfur dioxide emissions from the Mount Lyell Mining Company's operations killed the vegetation that the timber clearing had left behind. And what grew back, or more precisely, what didn't grow back, created a landscape that is unlike anything else in Australia. The hills are bare. They are multicoloured from the exposed mineral layers. They look like the surface of another planet, visible from the main road into town, and they have looked this way for over 100 years. The Mount Lyell Mining Company formed in 1889. Copper production ramped up from 1897. By 1911, Queenstown had a population above 5,000, a proper mining city in the wilderness of Western Tasmania, with the industrial infrastructure to process what the mountain was producing. The smelters ran on timber from the surrounding hills. The emissions from the smelters killed what the timber cutters left, and the result was a perfect loop of industrial extraction that transformed the landscape so completely that the transformation itself became the defining characteristic of the place. The smelter operations scaled back across the 20th century. Population followed the work. The 2021 ABS census recorded 1,838 residents, still the largest of the 5 settlements in this video, but a fraction of the boom-era population. The same census recorded 27.8% of Queenstown's dwellings as vacant. Land blocks now appear on homely.com.au at 38,000 Australians, with a second block in the same active listing feed at 45,000 Australians. These are not distressed prices in the way that Menzies or Andamuka are distressed. Queenstown has more population, more services, more functional community infrastructure. But they are prices that reflect a regional employment base that never replaced copper mining at the scale the town was built for. The hospital situation at Queenstown is the most extreme of any town in this video. The Northwest Regional Hospital sits 170 kilometres away. That is not a short drive under any circumstances, and on the roads that serve Tasmania's west coast, mountain passes, limited alternatives, weather exposure, it is a drive that requires real advanced planning for anything that isn't an emergency. If it is an emergency, the calculus becomes much harder. This is the honest arithmetic of living in Western Tasmania at this price point. The land is cheap because the services are far and the employment base is structurally weakened, and those two facts are connected. What Queenstown offers that money cannot straightforwardly replicate is a visual landscape with no parallel on the continent. The denuded hills have been documented in environmental literature for decades. The slow and contested process of potential regrowth, the question of whether the vegetation will ever return at scale, the argument between those who see the bare hills as a scar and those who see them as a legitimate industrial artifact worth preserving. The town has its own gravity. It draws people who have seen photographs and want to understand the place from the inside. It draws people who are running calculations about land cost versus lifestyle cost, and finding that at $38,000 Australian for a block in a functioning town
with a school and shops and a pub, the numbers say something that the eastern seaboard simply cannot compete with. Queenstown is also, and this matters, a town that has not finished deciding what it is. Environmental debates about the hills continue. Tourism investment is ongoing. The Mount Lyell name still carries weight in the regional consciousness, the way names of great industrial operations always do, long after the operations themselves have wound down. There are people here who have lived through multiple cycles of optimism and contraction, and are still here, still invested, still running businesses and raising families, in a town that every demographic model says should be smaller than it is. That stubbornness is worth something. At $45,000 Australian dollars for a land block at the upper end of current listings on homely.com.au, you are buying into a community that has refused, repeatedly, to simply stop existing. The bare hills above the town are not a warning. They are evidence. Evidence that the place survives things that should have finished it off, and that the price for getting in ahead of whatever comes next is still, in 2026, well under $50,000 Australian dollars. Underground houses in the desert. Land blocks under hills that have been bare for a century. Sandstone riverport architecture nobody's bidding on. 5 settlements where the standard Australian property conversation just stopped applying, because the systems that set those prices stopped paying attention. The question isn't whether these prices are real. The question is whether you're the kind of person who looks at a place that everyone else decided wasn't worth their attention and sees something different. Which of these 5 would you actually consider? Not as a thought experiment, for real. Drop it in the comments. Andamuka Dugout, Queenstown Hillside, Menzies Salt Pan, Wilcannia Sandstone, Zeehan Silvertown. Be specific. And if this kind of documented, unfiltered look at what Australia's land market actually contains is useful to you, subscribe. There are more places like this, and nobody's putting them on the front page.